Although the Japanese soldiers had their orders in April 1942, American and Filipino soldiers were captured by the Japanese as they surrendered and treated awfully. They had to walk around 70 miles to the Japanese prisoner of war camps, and because many were weak and maybe wounded, thousands of American and Filipino prisoners died during the Bataan March on Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines. New Mexico has its own reference to the war, since its National Guards were the first to fight in the Pacific War. The Japanese soldiers were cruel and tortured the American and Filipino POWs. America had to explore that they weren't the strongest country anymore, and the war against Japan was one of the hardest encounters America had to deal with in its history. But today, many people exchanged their thoughts and feelings about this historical event at the Memorial March in New Mexico. The beginning of the war between America and Japan started with the bombing on Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor was attacked by naval and air forces of Japan. Japanese warplanes sank or damaged 18 U.S. warships, destroyed 164 aircraft, and killed over 2,400 servicemen and civilians. Just one day after the bombing on Oahu, Hawaii, the Japanese started invading the Philippines. They were weakened from the long war with China, so they had to strike fiercely. America didn't want to get involved in World War II at first, but after the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, they sent their troops to the Philippines. On December 8th, President Franklin Roosevelt held a speech and asked Congress to declare war on Japan. America wasn't prepared to deploy so many soldiers. In 1941, the U.S. military was only 1/10 of what they are today. They had to use men from the National Guards all over the U.S. The New Mexican National Guard 200th Artillery was selected for an overseas mission of great importance. America had 30,000 soldiers stationed in the Philippines. There were 25,000 Filipino soldiers and 100,000 Filipino volunteers. The U.S. and Filipino Army had a lack of naval and air support, and as soldiers started dying from exhaustion more than from battle wounds, General Edward King Jr. surrendered his troops on April 9, 1942. 11,700 Americans and 65,000 Filipinos surrendered to the Japanese troops. Bill Malden was an artist who portrayed the seriousness of war situations in his cartoons, as he did in this drawing of the Bataan March. The Japanese didn't plan on having so many prisoners, so they couldn't transport them with trucks. But since the prisoners couldn't stay in the south, the only way the Japanese could get them to the north was by foot. Some wounded soldiers were taken by car, but most had to walk the 65-mile march through the jungles of the Philippines in the Oriental sun. Even though the Americans were weak and could not defend themselves, Japanese soldiers tortured their prisoners. As Lieutenant Colonel William Dias claims, an Air Force captain was searched and then beheaded because he was found with Japanese money in his possession. Around 600 to 700 American soldiers were killed or died from a variety of diseases. Of the 65,000 Filipinos who began the march, about 5,000 to 10,000 didn't make it because of many reasons. Soldiers died of diseases like malaria or dysentery. Others starved to death. Also, the Japanese soldiers had ways of torture. One way was to let soldiers rest on the street, just to be shot by the next group of Japanese. Another common way of torture was the so-called sun treatment. Soldiers had to look straight into the bright sun. Who fell or gave up was shot or stabbed. Towards the end of the march, the soldiers had to go by train. Too many soldiers were loaded into one car, and because of the bad air and heat, many soldiers died. After the horrible train ride, they had to walk another 5 miles without food or something to drink. Some prisoners were so desperate they ran into infested springs and suffered the terrible consequences. The strong soldiers tried to help the weak and risked their lives to save others. As they arrived at Camp O'Donnell, their suffering continued. The camp was designed for 10,000 people, but now 50,000 had to take shelter there. A young soldier made it his task to bury the dead. As Pedro Espinosa, a survivor of the Bataan March, told a reporter, he buried around 76 men a day. Major William Dias reported to the GHQ Weekly Summary, number 104 of the 29th October 1943. He said that the camp commander held a speech informing the prisoners that they would be treated as enemies of Japan. The Japanese were brutal, and although they had food supplies, they held their prisoners on a starvation diet. He claims that the death rate increased fast from 20 men daily in the first week to 50 men daily after the second week. As the Red Cross was finally allowed in camps, the prisoners got little food and medicine and could write letters home, but it still wasn't enough. In the following year, American and Filipino soldiers tried to free the imprisoned men. In Camp O'Donnell, there weren't any soldiers left, since they were either transferred or dead as the Americans arrived on the 30th of January in 1945. The Great Raid was a rescue mission from U.S. Army Rangers and Filipino guerrillas. It was their mission to free the prisoners from the Cabanatuan prison camp. First, they had to go 30 miles behind the Japanese lines. The soldiers had to attack at night, and the 30-minute raid saved 513 POWs. The liberated soldiers got medical care and were finally allowed to eat and drink. Until today, we don't know how many soldiers lost their lives fighting for their country. The numbers are huge. Around 18,300 Americans and 60,000 Filipinos died in the Battle of Bataan. Not to forget thousands of people who died in the Japanese captivity. Since New Mexico's population was only 530,000 people, and almost 2,000 men were in the Pacific War fighting for the 200th Coast Artillery, almost every family lost someone or knew another family that lost someone dear to the war. From over 1,800 National Guards who served in the 200th Coast Artillery, less than half returned. About 1/3 of the soldiers who returned home died within the first year because of mental problems or infections. The soldiers who died and the ones who lived showed us that even in the hardest times, when no hope is left, you have to believe. The only thing that got these men through this were their families, friends, and anything to hold on to. They didn't give up. I was very lucky to meet 3 Bataan Death March survivors.
U.S. Army dropped 5 OSS people into our camp.
America's encounter with Japan was brutal and ended in many deaths. But today, over 70 years later, thousands of people exchanged their thoughts at the annual Bataan Memorial Death March, which takes place at the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico.